What is a toy maker? Welcome back to the Spector Creative channel, and if you're like me, you love toys. And when you think of a toy maker, you probably think of, something like this, right? A older man with a big white beard, hand painting wooden toys. Well, it's actually completely true. In order to be a toy maker in the toy industry, you are required to be a Caucasian elderly man with white hair, preferably a beard, but eyebrows will work. And if you are not an elderly, balding white man, you're essentially barred from making toys. And you have, no, I'm totally kidding, but it isn't amazing how many of the stereotype does exist. Okay, let's get back to reality. So who is a toy maker? Well, obviously vendors in China who actually assemble the toys are toy makers. They're, putting it together. They're the ones doing the painting that you saw in the Rockwell painting earlier. But it takes a team. It does. It takes a team of very skilled specialists to come together. You could even say you have to create a team. I mean, not the A team, but you have to bring in different disciplines in order to go from concept to shelf. So I want to introduce kind of the 13 people, and yes, I know there's not 13 silhouettes here, but I couldn't find an image of 13 silhouettes, who are basically the who's who of the toy making process, from the brainstorm to post-mortem analysis. How do these toys get to shelf? Well, it starts with the marketing manager, and that was actually a role I played. The marketing manager tends to be the central hub that makes sure all the other cross-functional teams are, cross-functioning together. And as I mentioned, this was a role that I got to play at Mattel, Jada, Jax, and now actually at my own company, Spector Creative. And yes, I'm also a toy fan, and being a lifelong collector has added to my ability to understand the emotional connection of toy buying, and it's really what's led to a lot of success in my career. I went on to be a marketing manager at several companies. Most of them you've heard of, and, some of them you may not have. Hey, Loot Crate's still out there, right? All right. So what does a marketing manager do? Well, it is a lot of math. It's not my favorite part of the job, but it's also a lot of creativity. You have to make sure essentially everything hits its mark, but you're also in charge of the overall vision, meaning how many toys are going to be made, how many SKUs, how many in the assortment, which characters are going to get made. Now, all of this is done to increase sales. So just putting your favorite characters into an assortment is not going to lead to that, and if that happens, well, you're probably going to find yourself out of a job pretty quickly. So in order to express to the full team the needs of the annual toy line, usually the marketing manager will work with design to create what's called a B sheet, which shows how many SKUs you're going to make, how many of them are going to be full tool, partial tool, redeco, package refresh only. These are the different types of toys that can go into an assortment. All right, so like I said, you're going to work with a toy designer in order to create this B sheet and make sure it fits and hits all of the needed sales goals of the line that you're managing. But usually at this point now, it's the designer who comes on board once you lock in how many figures you're doing and which characters. So as an example, I had the honor and privilege of working with Bill Beneke for many years at Mattel, who's one of the more talented toy designers I know. And yes, this is what they do. It essentially starts with paper and pen, and you're coming up with what is that character going to look like once you have a sort of agreement with marketing that this is the character you're going to make. So there's going to be a lion in your jungle animals. Now, the toy designer does not always work out how all the parts come together. They do some of this work, but this really falls on the engineer. And this is one of the sort of, lesser-known heroes of the toy industry. The toy engineer is the one who figures out how the pieces come together. How many pieces do you need? What type of joints are going to be used? Do you need metal parts like screws or electronics? And when a figure has to be articulated, how will that articulation work? What type of joints, what type of connection pieces are needed? Now, if there's an action feature based on your character or includes one, so let's say you have to go from a character doing this to a character that's going to have an open-mouthed scream, well, it's up to the engineer to take the toy designer's vision of a screaming pop-up head into reality and figure out logistically, from an engineering standpoint, how does that happen? At this point, you'll go over to the sculptor. And sculptors with toys are very much like sculptors back in the day. Now, a lot of times sculpting is done now on the computer, creating digital files that can be shared to vendors in different parts of the cross-functional team, but a good deal is still done by hand. The Four Horsemen are one of the teams I worked with at Mattel that sculpted almost everything by hand. And once a figure was approved by the team and perhaps a licensor or upper management, we'll hit them at the end of the video, now the sculpt has to go on to the next person, which is the painter. And the painter usually works with the toy sculptor and possibly the engineer or designer. So speaking of the toy engineer, we're now back to this person again because they're going to take the sculpt from the sculptor, which is relatively inexpensive to make, turn that into a plastic copy, which then goes on to the vendor to create the expensive tool. So the sculpt is very different from the tool. Sculpt is, again, relatively easy, inexpensive. Well, you have to have talent to sculpt. The tool, this giant metal block, is what costs up to $100,000 or more based on the number of parts you have. More articulation, more detail, the more parts, the higher cost the tool. But this is where that one-time capital investment is, and it's the difference between the sculpt and the tool. All right, now there's another folk who has to be talked about, which is the cost engineer. This is the person who works between usually the engineer on the toy and the vendor to make sure that you're in the right costs, and if not, you have to cost reduce the figure, take things away. The most common thing to lose is deco, which is why we see a lot of Marvel Legends, as the cost increases to produce them, are losing more and more deco, and we're starting to get a lot of action figures that have almost no deco at all and just use the base color of the figure. All right, so that's only one half of the story. So much like Egyptian wall art that shows figures from half, we have to look at the other half, which is packaging. Now, this is also actually where I got my start in the toy business. I started in the packaging group, and this is also a group of multi-disciplined team members. So there's two basic types of packaging. You've got your closed box package, and then you have what's called a window box package. I mean, there's other things too. There's open trays, and there's just shelf tags like on stuffed animals. But those are the basic two. And this is going to take somebody who knows graphic design, which is not me. I mean, I can do some graphic design, but not what a graphic designer can do. They'll usually take a kit from a licensor, which has very specific colors, logo use, or if it's an IP that's owned by the toy company, especially if it's templated, like something like Hot Wheels basic cars, it's pretty easy for the graphic designer to just plop in new art. On the other hand, if a new line is created, whether it's a licensed line or IP owned, then the designer has to create an all-new look, which could create or require so many elements, including things like original logos that have to be created for a toy line. This happens all the time. Now, once obviously all the elements are created for a new line, those can be percolated throughout all of the SKUs, basic, track sets, or deluxe items, etc., etc. And then, of course, you have to have the physical sample that goes into something like the cross-sell. In the past, this has been done sometimes with paintings, but now it's usually done with photography, with a toy photographer who is skilled at shooting stills, basically, of product. Sometimes you need to bring in talent, though, so you have to bring in actual actors to interact with the toys, whether it's for cross-sells or for marketing material. Lastly, then, we have the copywriter. Well, actually, not lastly, secondly. This was what I started out as, a writer at Mattel. That was my first job in the toy industry. And as a copywriter, you're in charge of anything that's a word on that package. Now, it includes the name of the car, like this is Straight Pipes, which I got to name. It's a Larry Wood design I was honored to name. But it also means tracking all the safety warnings and the fine print and the licensor logos, and coming up with names for things like this Turbo Glow logo created by a graphic designer, but I came up with the name and the positioning line. A copywriter might also be in charge of writing bios and designing cross-sells in order to ensure that the right characters are represented based on what character you're buying. And a copywriter might also be drafted to help do print ads. It's not as common because a lot of times large companies will go with ad agencies. Finally, the last of the packaging team is the engineer. We're now up to our third engineer, right? Cost engineer, product engineer, now packaging engineer. A packaging engineer is the person who designs the physical box. Now, it sounds simple, but it's actually literally the opposite. If you're a packaging engineer, you're basically employed for life. It's really hard to find a really good, talented package engineer who understands how to create not just the outer package, but the inner package. Now, obviously, if you just have a blister tray that gets pulled out, that's a lot simpler. But anything that's a closed box is quite complicated because you have to figure out how the figure is going to nest inside and how all of that cardboard is going to be cut so it can fit inside the master box. All right. Then there's some smaller jobs too, but very important. Obviously, you have a safety person if you will, a safety rep, which is in charge of identifying what warnings, what adverse items have to be noted on packaging, and a lot of times this is done with official toy industry tools. So this is a small parts container, which is used by the safety rep, or sometimes the engineer, could be the same person. And if an item can fit inside, it's considered a small part. If it can't, it's not. And that's literally how the toy industry defines what a small part is and whether or not a toy needs that particular warning. The person who brings all this together is then the planner. This is the person who usually is in charge of scheduling weekly meetings where all the cross-functional team comes together, and the planner is in charge of all of the milestones that have to be hit along the total production schedule. When you have to have approvals, it's kind of like going along a board game, right? And every time you move to another square, there's different essential checkoffs that have to happen. You have to have a certain progression for the packaging, the toy. And then, of course, you've got your licensor. So if the toy concept isn't owned by the toy company, you work with a licensor who owns it to get approval every step of the way. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the actual vendor overseas who's going to confirm costing with the cost engineer and is going to actually create the physical product. And then, of course, R&D, trying to figure out what toys to make, and obviously upper management has to be thrown in there too because someone's got to approve these things. So yeah, it takes a village, a very strong village. If you've got a weak village that burns down easily, yeah, toys are probably not going to make it to market. And it takes a lot of talent and a lot of different folks. At large companies, usually these are very different people. But at smaller ones, a lot of times it's one person wearing a lot of hats. I've worked in both environments. They have their advantages and disadvantages. But without all of these roles, every single job that has to be done, you're not getting to a toy product, which is why so many people are involved in the toy making process and why there's so much opportunity if you're interested in joining that process to jump in. So many different diverse talents and so many diverse needs. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, the best way to show support for this channel is to share it, and I thank you for that. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to hit them back, and thank you as always for watching here on the Spector Creative channel.